second nutrient-enriched spiritual staple for students is a personal relationship with you. This is because a personal relationship with you can facilitate students being drawn to the Savior. He will always be the real source of spiritual nutrition. But the relationship between teacher and learner helps learners be open to the Savior's words. Even years after your formal teaching of students ends, your relationship can continue to exert a positive influence in their lives. Your lasting influence will be because you have, out of a deep love and concern for their welfare, pointed them to the Lord and His doctrine, rather than to yourselves. I've experienced this. One of my primary teachers, Becky, had that kind of an influence on me. When I was a child, instead of harping on my obvious mistakes, Becky would catch me doing something good. She'd squeeze my cheek, pat me on the head, and say, "Dale, you're such a good boy." I didn't find this demeaning. Rather, I looked forward to those occasions when it happened. Later, when I was a youth, no longer in primary, my family returned to that ward after living for years in Finland and Sweden. Becky came up to me after I passed the sacrament, squeezed me on the cheek, patted me on the head, and said, "Dale, you're such a good boy." When I returned from my mission, after I reported my missionary experiences in a sacrament meeting, Becky came up to me, squeezed me on the cheek, patted me on the head, and said, "Dale, you're such a good boy." Over the ensuing decades, I made better choices than I otherwise would have made, in part because Becky directed me toward the Savior, and I did not want to disappoint her. One Sunday, after I was called to the 12, I returned to the ward where I grew up. Becky still lives in that ward. I sat at the end of the rostrum, spoke briefly in the sacrament meeting, and sat down. Following the benediction, Becky, then in her mid-80s, conducted a sneak attack. She came up around the choir seats behind me, came over to the side, squeezed my cheek, patted me on the head, and said, "Dale, you're such a good boy." Each student needs one or more Beckys in their lives. Teachers who have a lifelong relationship with them, someone who has pointed them to the Savior, someone who affects their thinking and behavior, someone they do not want to disappoint. When students are wounded by crises that they will undoubtedly experience, you can provide a safe place for them to turn to for love and reassurance. Admittedly, there may be some who resist your attempts to know them, but that doesn't prevent you from loving them. You may have a greater influence on resistant students than you think.